When Trump's tax-to-win strategy ended in a devastating failure, did anyone see it coming? The trade war with China was once hailed as a way to make America stronger, but the reality turned out to be the exact opposite. Not only did the US fail to win, it ended up hurting itself, businesses, workers, and consumers all bearing the brunt of the fallout. So, what caused this bold move to become the most painful stumble in modern trade history? Let's uncover the truth behind the numbers and policies. It all started with an announcement that sounded like good news. After more than 1 year of intense trade tension, the United States and China had finally shook hands. It seemed like both sides were making concessions to move toward a mutually beneficial deal. But hold on a second. The truth is, it was actually the US that stepped back. Specifically, Trump agreed to sharply cut tariffs, from 30% down to only 10% on a package of goods worth $2 billion imported from China. And in return, nothing clear from China. No firm commitments were made. This agreement was only set to last 90 days, a true ceasefire of sorts. A pause, not a resolution. To be blunt, this was not a victory but a painful retreat for the United States. Trump, who had confidently beaten the drum of aggressive tariff policies, was now forced to back down. And what about China? They didn't give an inch. Instead, they drew the US back to the negotiating table without having to make any upfront concessions. All the advantages Trump had painstakingly built over more than 1 year through tariff policies simply vanished in this decision to step back. So, what began as a fight Trump hoped would make China pay ended with the US retreating and China holding its ground. A ceasefire that seemed calm on the surface was, in reality, a home defeat. The United States was forced to make the first concession, and this marked the beginning of a major setback in the trade war with China. China refused to come to the negotiating table until the United States agreed to reduce tariffs, and President Trump accepted this. Tariffs that were previously set at 30% were suddenly lowered to just 10% on goods worth $2 billion. It might sound like progress, but in reality, this was a significant concession on the part of the United States. What is particularly notable is that China did not make any specific commitments in exchange for this tariff reduction. They did not promise to increase purchases of American goods, something President Trump had pledged would create jobs and support domestic manufacturers. They also did not agree to prevent intellectual property theft, which has been one of the main sources of tension for the United States. Moreover, control over fentanyl exports, a drug causing a major crisis in the United States, was not even mentioned. In other words, the United States lost its greatest leverage without receiving anything in return. Tariffs, which were regarded as a powerful tool to force China to concede, have now become just a reduced figure on paper without delivering any real benefits. President Trump gave up a strategic weapon without gaining any value in return, casting doubt on the entire tariff policy effort, and marking it as a significant failure. Have you ever wondered how President Trump's tariff policies have actually impacted the lives of American workers and businesses? The truth is, these measures have caused quite a lot of difficulties, even severe losses for both sides. When President Trump imposed high tariffs on Chinese goods, the consequences did not just stay on paper. They quickly landed on the shoulders of American businesses and workers. Companies lost interest in expanding investment. They stopped hiring, and some even had to lay off workers or reduce working hours to save costs. Many factories faced production slowdowns because raw material prices soared, making business operations tougher than ever before. Workers suffered a double blow. Their incomes decreased, while the prices of goods from electronics to clothing went up, driving living costs higher and higher. This created a heavy financial pressure on American families. One interesting yet painful phenomenon is what economists call price stickiness. When tariffs were imposed, stores raised their prices immediately, but when tariffs were temporarily lowered, prices either did not decrease or dropped very slowly. Retailers were reluctant to reduce prices because they feared losing profits or because adjusting prices takes time. In other words, American consumers still had to pay high prices even though tariffs were eased. So the financial burden did not lessen in the short term. President Trump once promised a bright vision. American businesses would withdraw from China and bring their supply chains back to their own country. The goal was very clear: to create jobs, boost domestic production, and make America stronger than ever before. Sounds very appealing, right? But the reality has been much harsher. Instead of returning to the US, many businesses chose to relocate their supply chains to other countries such as Vietnam, India, and Mexico. These countries have lower costs, easier investment environments, and are rapidly becoming new global manufacturing hubs. This means the US gains no benefit from this relocation. On the contrary, America is being pushed out of the global manufacturing competition and gradually losing its central position in the international supply chain network. This is a significant shock to those who believed tariffs would bring everything back to the way it was. This is the clearest evidence showing that imposing tariffs is not the key to revitalizing domestic manufacturing. It only causes everything to shift elsewhere, leaving the US at a disadvantage. When tariffs were imposed, everyone expected major changes, especially a reduction in the trade deficit with China, a long-standing, painful problem. However, the results were disappointing. The trade deficit did not decrease, but remained at a high level, frustrating many. Furthermore, another important goal was to stop the flow of fentanyl, an extremely dangerous drug smuggled from China, but this goal was not achieved either. Tariffs were presented as a way to pressure China into controlling this issue, but in reality, the situation has not changed. In addition, tariff policies have not altered China's rigid economic structure. Massive state subsidies continue, the government tightly controls the manufacturing sector, and market and technology manipulation activities still occur as usual. All of this shows that tariffs are only a temporary measure, insufficient to fundamentally change the strategic problems the US aims to solve. Have you ever noticed that every time import tariffs on Chinese goods increase, the prices on supermarket shelves skyrocket as well? That is the reality American consumers have to bear. Tariffs make imported goods more expensive, which means consumers' wallets are gradually emptied every time they shop. Unfortunately, even with ceasefire agreements or tariff reductions afterward, American consumers receive almost no benefit. Prices remain high because businesses take advantage of the opportunity to raise prices, and they have no reason to lower them again. Moreover, for the next 90 days, things will likely remain the same. Prices are unlikely to cool down because businesses have already raised prices and have no incentive to revert to previous levels. In the end, American consumers are the ones who directly suffer the losses from these tariff policies. When China set the condition that the US must reduce tariffs before continuing negotiations, who would have thought the US would respond firmly? In reality, the US immediately agreed to this condition without receiving any clear commitments from China. This was like the US voluntarily conceding and giving the opponent more control. During those 90 days, China did not simply pause the dispute. They used this valuable time to continue maintaining exports, plan for a long-term response to US pressures, and strengthen their supply chains in Southeast Asia and many other partners. In other words, China was the active party, benefiting and continuing to control the game during this period. The US, meanwhile, only received a temporary truce agreement with unclear practical benefits. Upon hearing news of the 90-day truce agreement, the US stock market immediately reacted positively, with stock prices soaring as if receiving a boost of morale. Everyone wants to believe in a hopeful outcome amid a prolonged and tense trade war. However, looking deeper into reality, the situation is not so bright. The economic foundations behind it remain unchanged, all core problems remain unsolved. The belief that these 90 days would lead to a comprehensive long-term agreement is very fragile. It can be said that Trump used this agreement as a way to save his political image before the election, creating a sense that he was in control. But is this truly a long-term strategy? It is very difficult to confirm. An important lesson drawn from this trade war is that applying unilateral tariffs is not an effective path in today's globalized economy. Global supply chains cannot be easily fragmented by just a few tariff rates, because businesses always find ways to adapt and relocate elsewhere to reduce costs. The reality is that the US cannot quickly replace China as the global manufacturing hub in a short time. Forcing companies to return to the US solely through unilateral tariffs has not been effective. Instead, it pushed businesses to move to other countries, such as Vietnam, India, or Mexico. Therefore, instead of going alone with unilateral measures, the US needs to shift toward a multilateral cooperative strategy, closely linking with allies to create greater and more sustainable pressure in international trade. This is the real way to regain long-term position and advantage in the global game. The America First policy was once hoped to bring jobs back home and provide more opportunities for American workers. But the reality is completely different. Jobs did not return to the US as Trump promised. Instead, companies shifted production to other countries, while American workers faced unemployment or unstable jobs. Moreover, living costs in the US have been rising due to higher prices of imported goods caused by tariffs. This makes life harder for citizens, destabilizes the market, and reduces confidence in the future. In addition, the growth rate of the US GDP did not meet expectations, causing many to begin doubting the effectiveness of the economic policies introduced by the Trump administration. America First suddenly became a story about an America hurting itself. The plan to use tariffs to force China to concede seemed like a smart move, but turned out to be seriously counterproductive. The United States ultimately had to concede, reducing tariffs, but in return gained nothing clear or specific. Meanwhile, American businesses struggled. Workers lost jobs or faced income reductions, and consumers had to bear skyrocketing prices. They were the ones who suffered the heaviest losses in this war. As for China, instead of wavering, they calmly stood firm, using exactly 90 days of rest to consolidate their position and find ways to go even further. And in the end, the message that the whole world clearly saw was this: the trade war initiated by Trump was not a victory, but a historic step backward for America. This is a vivid testament to the mistake of turning tariffs into a political and economic weapon, a double-edged sword that America ended up stabbing itself with.